Good morning. Good morning and welcome back to our third and final week side-trekking through Daniel on our way back to Revelation. It says so very clearly in my notes that this is the third and final week, and so I have to assume that is correct and that we will therefore get through everything we need to cover today with no issues whatsoever. We had left off last time around looking at Daniel's visions in sort of the middle of the book, right? So if I cut back a slide or two here, our first week in Daniel, we had recapped our way through Near Eastern ancient history, right? We looked at the successive empires that appear in Daniel's visions. The empire of Babylon, the Medo-Persian Empire that follows that up, right? Under Cyrus, under other Persian kings, Darius the Mede, folks like that. We looked at Alexander the Great and his Macedonian Empire that spreads out. And then finally at the Empire of Rome as the last of the major empires to appear within Daniel's visions. We also talked in particular about the descendants of Alexander's empire, the Seleucid Empire, right? This group that in particular has this one nasty king called Antiochus Epiphanes, and how he in particular persecutes the Jews, leads to this rebellion that we remember as being the Maccabean revolt, right? Told to us in the books of Maccabees, remembered today through Hanukkah, and how this again is one of the key points, the key figures that appears in the visions that Daniel presents to us. So we laid out that history in the first week. We looked at the first of his visions, this vision of the statue and the different metals, and we saw how the different parts of the statue correspond to the different empires down through time. Then last week we looked at the visions in Daniel 7 and 8. In Daniel 7 we saw this succession of beasts, and we saw how the beasts, right, there was a lion with eagle wings, and there was a bear, and there was a goat, right, and each of these different, I guess the goat's the next one to it, but there are a succession of different beasts, and so each beast then represents one of these different empires, and we saw that following through until this last terrible, terrifying beast that was unlike the others, that destroyed all the others, and was itself destroyed by God. We saw as well in chapter 8 this vision of a ram with two horns, representing the Medo-Persian Empire, right? One of the horns is bigger than the other every time we see it, where it's lopsided, the bear is lopsided, the ram is lopsided, right? Every time there's one of them where one side's bigger than the other, we recognize that's the Medes and the Persians. And then that is itself destroyed by this goat out of Greece, that the goat comes up and destroys the ram, but then its horn breaks off and the horn splits 4 different ways, and a little horn comes off of one of the big horns growing out of it, right? And we left off last time around looking at this odd question that Daniel 7 and 8 both contain a figure described as a little horn. Right? At the end of Daniel 7, there's this great and terrifying beast, and it has 10 horns, but 3 of the horns are ripped out of its head, and a little horn grows up among them. And we're told that the little horn has eyes and a mouth, and it boasts, and it wars against the people of God. And then again, in Daniel chapter 8, the goat has these 4 horns that grow out of it. And we said, look, historically, this is really easy. The goat is Alexander the Great. It's his empire spreading rapidly all over the world. Alexander dies. His empire splits into 4 pieces, right? 4 horns, 4 heads on the leopard in the previous chapter. 4 heads on the leper would be a very different picture. On the leopard in chapter 7, right? Again, this picture of these 4 successors to Alexander. One of these then goes on to be the Seleucid Empire, where Antiochus Epiphanes becomes one of the kings of that empire. And we said, so the question now is, we've got 2 chapters in a row that have a figure described as a little horn that is boastful, that is arrogant, that is wise in some ways, that is warring against the people of God. 2 successive chapters describe a little horn, and our question is this the same guy in chapter 7 as it is in chapter 8? So I gave here the passages again just to look at those in a little more detail. As for the 10 horns, out of this kingdom, this is the 4th kingdom, the beast, out of this kingdom 10 kings shall arise, and another after them, and he shall be different from the former ones, and shall put down 3 kings. He shall speak words against the Most High and wear out the saints of the Most High, and think to change the times and the law, and they shall be given to his hand for a time, times, and half a time. That's in chapter 7. Again, if you want to flip over a page to chapter 8, we're describing the goat. Out of one of his horns came a little horn, which grew exceedingly great toward the south, the east, and the glorious land. It grew great even to the host of heaven. And some of the host and some of the stars it threw to the ground, and it trampled on them. Skipping a bit, and the regular burnt offering was taken away from him, and the place of his sanctuary was overthrown. Okay, so we talked last time about some reasons to think these are or are not the same guy. Can you give me a reason to think these are or are not the same figure? How about some similarities between them? What do they have in common? Start with this. They are both described as little horns, right? Let's just start with the obvious one. Daniel back-to-back has visions that say, here's a guy, he's a little horn. That seems like a pretty striking similarity, right? What else do we see?
Upend whatever religious rituals or traditions are there and replace it.
Okay, good. So they are destroying the religion, the religious practices of the saints of God is how this is described, right? The one we are told will put an end to the appointed times. Daniel's readers might have understood that as feast days or, holy celebrations would be ended. And then the other, we are told, will put an end to sacrifice, right? That he will upend the sanctuary in some significant way. Both of them opposing what the Jews of Daniel's day would have understood as the proper reverence, the proper worship of God. Good. What else do we see? Do you see any others? We talked briefly about this last week. The first horn is described as being covered in eyes. And remember, every time we see eyes in prophecy, eyes are representative of what? Wisdom, insight, right? So there's a wisdom to this horn. I don't have it in the quote here, but in chapter 8, we are told that the horn in chapter 8 understands riddles, right? He can solve mysteries. And so again, there's an idea of wisdom there. We can see in both of them an idea of their ending. In each case, we're not told, oh, he'll be overthrown by an army, or oh, he'll be beaten by the saints rising up against him. We're told ultimately that his judgment is from God, that he has an appointed end from the Lord that's his destruction. These are reasons to think these might be the same guy. There's a lot of overlap between them. Do you see any reasons to think they're not the same person?
Didn't we decide timing was off?
Timing's weird, right? First horn comes up out of the beast. We typically think the beast is Rome, right? The beast comes after the Empire of Greece. That seems like the Roman Empire. And yet the second horn comes off the goat's Greece. This seems like the Seleucids. This seems like our old friend Antiochus again. And so how can these be the same guy if they're growing off of two completely different empires, right? That's kind of a problem. Really, that's the biggest problem. There's some details different between them, this whole business with the horns being ripped out and everything. But the biggest problem is they just seem to be coming at the wrong time. One other problem is their duration is different. We are told that the little horn in chapter 7 will persist for a time, times, and half a time. Now, we've talked about this as a repeating figure. How long is a time times half a time, would most commentators say? 3.5 years, right? That's a figure we're going to keep seeing. On the other hand, we're told that if you look at chapter 8, do you see a duration associated with the little horn in chapter 8? Do you see a number of days laid out in chapter 8? I'm making you speed read this morning. 2,300 evenings and mornings. Good. We said there's disagreement as to whether that's 2,300 days or, 1150 of one and 1150 of the other, right? 1,150 days. But either way, it's not 3.5 years. It's not that same duration of time, yeah? And so there's different durations associated with these guys. Does that suggest to us then that they are different figures? Well, so there's historic disagreement on this, right? Here are some possibilities that people have had in trying to resolve these two chapters. Here's the first possibility. First possibility is We keep saying the first little horn is Rome and the second little horn is Greece. Maybe we're wrong about that. Maybe both little horns belong to Greece. They are both Antiochus Epiphanes. So here's how that would work. Second horn's easy. We already think he comes out of Greece, right? First little horn is hard. We got 4 beasts. We got a lion. That's Babylon, no question. We got a bear who's raised up on one side, right? Everybody pictures the bear walking around like this. We got a leopard with 4 heads. And then we've got this beast who's unlike the others, right? And we said, cool, Babylon, Medes and Persians, Alexander the Great, Rome, yeah? One way of reading this is to say, nope, we have that wrong. It's Babylon, Medes, Persians, Alexander the Great. You see it? And in that case, if our 4th beast is Alexander, everything checks out. Except that doesn't really work real well, does it? Right? I mean, what were some... Let's think that through. The 3rd beast, the leopard, he's the fast one. The Persians aren't especially fast. The 3rd beast has got the 4 heads, like the goat has the 4 horns. Well, that fits real nice with Alexander. It kind of doesn't make any sense if it's the Persians. The bear is raised up on one side, just like the ram is raised up on one side in a minute. That works really well if it's the Medes as the silent partner and the Persians as the dominant one. It's kind of weird if it's just, you get it, right? You see in this? And so that's a possibility, but I don't think it's a very good one. Second possibility, these might just be totally separate guys. One guy is the little horn in chapter 7, one guy is the little horn in chapter 8. That could be true. It's just kind of a little strange that they're both described as little horns back to back in that case. It feels like Daniel wants us to link these two in our minds. Why do that if there's no connection between them? Third, they could both be pointing to some more final fulfillment. And so if you hold to more of a position of a final Antichrist, both of these could be prefigurements of that final figure, that final fulfillment. And so they've hit different details historically, but they come together at an ending. Does that make sense? Now, nothing in Daniel chapter 7 or 8 says this is going to have one guy who satisfies it at first and then another guy who satisfies it later, right? So we have to kind of squint at it if that's what's going on too. I think at least these two are both plausible interpretations here, right? I think the first one you really got to stretch to make that work. But I think the last two could both be the explanation, evidence in hand here. We do have some reason to think there's still future fulfillment of these passages coming, right? We've talked about that Christ in Matthew 24 points and says that at least in his time, some of these prophecies are yet to be fulfilled. That is at least suggestive that there may be some final fulfillment ahead for them. Is everybody with me on that? Anybody got a question? I know we kind of left things quick at the end of last week. Anybody got anything before we press forward today?
It does seem to me that, while we look at Rome as being the Roman Empire, Rome is really kind of the start of Western European culture.
True. Yeah, Rome is really the root of...
Still going on.
Rome is really the root of Europe today. You can follow the divisions of most of the great nations.
The United States, for that matter.
Sure, which itself grows out of European culture, right? So you can follow the modern political divisions in many cases directly out of the way the empire breaks up.
So I'm not sure that Rome necessarily ends.
Okay.
Say it does. Or we are the embodiment of the mixture of the iron and the clay.
Okay, good. So one argument then to say maybe this points to a future fulfillment is to point all the way back to Daniel 2 and to say in Daniel 2 we had not 4 divisions but 5, right? We had Babylon, Medes and Persians, Greece, Rome, and then we had these feet made of iron and clay, and we said, that's somebody. It's sure something. We're not sure, is that past, is that future, what is that? And so there's a division there that doesn't appear in chapter 7.
But Rome mixed with the barbarians might fit pretty well.
Might fit with that, and so there could be some still remaining fulfillment that the little horn is pointing to as part of the feet of clay. One hint that might be the case is, remember we emphasized, and if I was wearing sandals, I could pick my foot up here and wiggle it at you, right? We emphasized the 10 little piggies on the feet, right? Daniel goes out of his way to emphasize there's 10 toes there. Now what do we see in chapter 7? We see a beast with 10 horns on it. Is that a significant numerical repetition? Plausibly, right? In which case maybe there's a connection there. In which case maybe there's a through line. Illustrating that a little better, right? We've got clear alignments in some places, clear things we can point to and say, this is definitely that. Again, Daniel's real convenient for us and turns to the angel next to him a couple of times and is like, and who is that? And the angel very helpfully says, that's the king of Greece, Daniel. And so there's not a lot of mystery left on some of these things, right? That's pretty convenient for us. Toward the end, the question marks start creeping back in. Yeah? Who is, if the little horn is one guy, who is it in particular? Might just be Antiochus, right? Could just be it's Antiochus the whole way through, especially if you think that last beast is still the Greeks or the Seleucids or something like that. Again, I think that really struggles. Antiochus doesn't overthrow 3 kings to get to his position, right? That really doesn't seem to work well for me, for the passage here. But that's one possible interpretation. Another is that this could be Nero, right? Nero certainly is a king who wars against the people of God, right? He certainly is, he conducts a campaign against Israel that lasts for 3.5 years before Nero's death. Nero is not killed by any other human hand. He commits suicide at the end of his reign. And so is this pointing to Nero is at least the first of these little horns? He's, of course, Roman, right? He's a Roman emperor. Well, maybe. But Nero doesn't come after 10 other kings either. Nero is the 6th emperor of Rome, depending how you count it. He doesn't overthrow 3 guys before him. Some people point this in and they say, but there are 10 divisions of Rome. There are 10 provinces. And 3 of those provinces go into revolt against Nero. And that could work. But this doesn't say 3 kings will rise up against him. It says 3 kings will be put down by him, right? He will wipe out 3 other kings. That doesn't quite seem to fit, but maybe that's it. Maybe Nero at least seems to partially fit the little horn. If we think there's a final fulfillment here, maybe he's at least a piece of it. Some people thought it was Napoleon. Some people thought it was a lot of folks, right? I mean, you can eventually get Henry Kissinger on this list and Bill Gates. And there's a lot of people you can point to eventually. Some people, of course, Martin Luther in his day said that he thought there were 2 antichrists. He said one of them was the head of the Muslim empire and the other one was the Pope, right? Because of course, the Pope grows up out of Rome, does he not, right? Doesn't he make great boasts to being the vicar of Christ? It's not the Pope, guys, right? Can we all agree? It is not the Pope. But this was historically an interpretation within Protestant Christendom. And then, of course, it might be some unidentified figure yet to come. Okay, that's Daniel 7 and 8. I'm going to shuffle them off to the side here and press forward.
Can I ask one more question?
Oh, no, yes, go ahead, Vern. Yeah.
How sure are we about the accuracy of that? Because really, I mean, the 1150 days.
It is 3 years and change, right?
It's 3 years and change. So, I mean, it seems to me like a description of times and a half a time could very easily be interpreted as 3 years and change.
Okay, good. So this is going to be a problem throughout here, which is how precise is the prophecy, right? Is the prophecy meaning to land to the day, or is God giving a general frame of when approximately to watch for here, right? If it's 3 years and 6 months and 1 week, do we say, well, can't be that. That didn't satisfy the prophecy.
I mean, I got 3.15 years. I mean,
it wasn't that far off, right? Yeah, good. We don't know, right?
Okay.
That's about to come up here as well.
I just know how, as the scholars look at the times and a half a time, I wasn't sure how sure they were about
The half?
Well, yeah, about how accurately
Right.
that is intended to be.
Yeah, it's a great question. We can point very directly to some specific numbers on things like, for instance, Antiochus's suspension of sacrifices in the temple. For instance, we know that that's, or at least what I've read says, we know that that's exactly 3 years and 10 days, right? Now, I'd be willing to go with 3.5 is 3 and a fraction, right? 3 and a part. But it's not 2,300 or 1,150, right? 3 years and 10 days isn't either of those figures. So, like, what's going on with that one if that's the fulfillment of it? Does that make sense?
Sure.
I think it's plausible that 3.5 is not exactly dead on 3.5, and at the stroke of midnight, everything changes over. You get some amount of wiggle room there, right? Is it enough? The problem is we're about to see a couple more numbers pop up that also don't exactly align with any of the ones we've seen so far. The secular interpretation, by the way, is that the reason there's a bunch of different numbers here is that Daniel is right. It's not Daniel writing Daniel. Can we start with that, right? It's some other guy writing Daniel in the time of Antiochus Epiphanes, and he keeps making prophecies for when Antiochus is getting kicked out. And so at first he's like, it's going to be 3 years. And then that doesn't happen. He's like, 3 years and a few months, and writes that onto the end. It's going to be closer to 4, and he just keeps tacking on to the end a few more days. Now, you would think that that was not a very persuasive writing style. It doesn't seem like a great explanation to be like there's just a footnote that says, P.S. and 2 more weeks every couple of weeks. But that is basically the secular interpretation of this, right? That's the non-prophetic interpretation. Our interpretation is just that some of it gets kind of darn mysterious, right? We are not sure how all the numbers line up with each other. Good question. Anybody else? Okay. All right. Daniel 8, set it aside. We got enough puzzlement there. Let's go on to Daniel 9. Daniel 9. Daniel 9 starts in a really interesting way. Daniel's reading his Old Testament. He's reading the book of Jeremiah. And he reads in Jeremiah the thing we read back at the start of this digression. He reads this prophecy that God gives to Jeremiah that says, when 70 years are complete for Babylon, I will visit you and I will fulfill my promise and bring you back to this place, that is, to Jerusalem, to Israel. And Daniel looks at his Old Testament, and the funny thing here is Daniel does exactly what we're trying to do right now, right? Daniel looks and he goes, okay, I got brought back in 605. It's been almost, he doesn't call it 605 BC for obvious reasons, but you understand, right? It's been almost 70 years since I got dragged off to Babylon. We should be going home soon. And so Daniel stops and prays for the, and this is the interesting part, for the literal fulfillment of God's timetable as promised in prophecy. And he says, you said it was going to be 70 years. It's been almost 70 years. Have we suffered enough, right? Can we be forgiven now of the sins that we have committed that we continue to forget? Can you bring us back to the land as you promised that you would do? And he begins praying this desperately to God. And I think it's fascinating that in one of the passages that we argue about so much as to whether these times and dates should be literal and how exact they should be and how we ought to, Daniel just kind of looks at Jeremiah and he says, well, it says 70 years, it's got to mean 70 years, right? That's just got to be what it is. And he is, in fact, correct. Daniel, as we said, goes off into captivity at 605. In 535 BC, Ezra returns. Ezra, the priest, right? Author of the book of Ezra. Ezra comes back to the Promised Land to rebuild Jerusalem, to reenact, many of the things that have been destroyed, to set the kingdom back up again. And so Daniel's looking ahead to the fulfillment of prophecy is satisfied. Now, Daniel utters this prayer, and maybe you remember the story. He's praying for days and for weeks, and he gets no answer. And then finally an angel shows up and says, hey, listen, I've been trying to get to you ever since you started praying, but the prince of Babylon and the prince of Persia has been fighting me this whole time that I've been trying to get to you, and it isn't until I got reinforcements that I managed to break through and get here and give you this message. And boy howdy, there's a lot going on there that we don't have time to get into, right? That's somebody else's problem. We're going to just deal with what the angel says when he does get there. So the angel shows up, he says, I've fought through, I've won through the battle lines, I've gotten to you to give you this message. Here is the message. 70 weeks are decreed about your people and your holy city to finish transgression, to put an end to sin, to atone for iniquity, to bring in everlasting righteousness, to seal vision and prophet, and to anoint a most holy place. Know therefore that from the going out of the word to restore and build Jerusalem to the coming of an anointed one, a prince, there shall be 7 weeks. Then for 62 weeks it, that is Jerusalem, shall be built again with squares and moat, but in a troubled time. And after the 62 weeks an anointed one shall be cut off and shall have nothing. And the people of the prince who is to come shall destroy the city and the sanctuary. Its end shall come in a flood, and at the end there shall be war. Desolations are decreed. And he shall make a strong covenant with many for 1 week, and for 1/2 of the week he shall put an end to sacrifice and offering. And on the wing of abominations shall come one who makes desolate, until the decreed end is poured out on the desolator. Okay, so there's been a lot of bad visions lately, a lot of visions of empires, but now we've got a promise of a restoration of Jerusalem. Daniel's praying about this, right? Will the kingdom be built again? And he's told yes. Yes, and then there will be 70 weeks. Well, 70 weeks, we're pretty sure the weeks are not weeks, right? We generally read this as weeks of years. This would be read something like 77s. I think that's actually the literal of it is 77s here. There will be 490 periods. Often we read this as 490 years. Put an asterisk on that thought and let's come back to it, okay? There's going to be this period, and it will be split up several different ways. There's a 7, there's a 62, and there's a 1. You add those up, you get back 70, everybody's happy. For the first 69 of them, he says everything's good with Jerusalem, right? There will be trouble, but the city will be built again. And then after that point, an anointed one will be cut off. Now, when we see the phrase the anointed one, who do we think of? Christ, right? The Messiah literally is the anointed one. Now, this doesn't say the anointed one, right? It says an anointed one. Obviously, we're reading some English articles into some of the Hebrew and the Aramaic here to make sense of this thing. But there's an anointed one cut off. And we think, okay, the anointed one is Christ. The anointed one is cut off. That kind of sounds like an event that we'd be familiar with, right? That sounds like crucifixion language to us. Christ cut off after 69 weeks. Now, maybe that's the right reading, maybe it's not. I'm just kind of laying out some surface thoughts here, right? Then some bad things seem to happen. Desolations are decreed does not sound like something you want to be true of your neighborhood, right? And he shall make a strong covenant with many, and for half of the week. That feels familiar, doesn't it? There's that 3.5 years again. For half of the week he shall make a covenant, and then there will be an abomination that causes desolation until an end is poured out on the desolator. Okay, so let's take this into pieces. We've got 70 weeks of years, 490 years. Maybe they're real years, maybe they're not real years. Come back for that. I've been doing the ESV for my verses here, and I wanted to be consistent in this. But this verse is kind of messy in the ESV. From the going out of the word to restore and build Jerusalem, to the coming of the anointed one, there shall be 7 weeks. Now, remember we said Ezra comes back at about 535, right? Does Jesus show up 49 years after that? He does not, right? We all good on that part? That doesn't happen. And so what is this? Well, a Jewish reading of this says, this anointed one obviously says this is not Christ, right? It will not shock anybody that the Jewish reading of Daniel does not associate Jesus with any of these verses, yeah? The Jewish rendering of this says that 49 years later, you get this King Cyrus, right? This Persian King Cyrus, and that Cyrus gives orders to reestablish Jerusalem. Now, it's not exactly 49 years later. Vern, this comes back to your point. How precise do we have to be? Cyrus gives orders to rebuild some things after 52 years. Is that close enough that it's after 7 sevens? Historic Jewish interpretation says yes.
Well, it's not 8 sevens.
Wasn't 8 sevens, right? It was within the 7th seven. Maybe that counts.
One digit accuracy.
There we go. One significant digit, right? And then Jerusalem gets built again for a long period after that. That's the ESV. Other translations, so if I go to the NASB says that until the Messiah comes, there will be 7 weeks and 62 weeks. It says smush the two together, 69 total weeks. That's 483 years. Now, does 483 years get you to a more reasonable time if we're looking for Christ here? Well, it does. It gets you at least closer. Let's pause closer and come back to it. I'm throwing a lot of numbers at you here. Is this making sense, right? Which interpretation is this? Is the right one? I don't know. I'm not a Bible translator, right? There are good Christian translators who've looked at this passage and have read it differently. Is there a 7 and then something happens and there's 62 more? Or is everything happening at the end of the 69? There's some syntactic ambiguity is my understanding of it, right? It could be read either way. Then there's 62 weeks go by and the anointed one is cut off. Now, different Christian commentators have looked at this and they have read it different ways. Typically, Christians look at the end of this period, right? 69 weeks after the call to rebuild Jerusalem goes out. And they say, if I cut forward 483 years, can I get to a significant date in the life of Christ? Now, if we're going to answer that, we got to know some things, right? If I add 483 to a number, do I get anywhere significant? What are some things I need to know? Where to start? It's real useful to know what the start date is. We do not know what the start date is. We have, in fact, about 4 different possible places that we could have as the start date here, because there is not one single decree that goes out to rebuild Jerusalem. There are about 4, right? Nehemiah gets sent back. Ezra gets sent back. There's an order to rebuild the temple. There's the point where the temple actually does get rebuilt. Which of those is our start date? We don't know, but you get different end dates depending when you start, right? Depending which of those you pick, you get anywhere in the range between 538 and 445 BC. You see the problem? Yeah.
On whose calendar?
On ours.
Because some you've got like the 360 days.
Sure.
Babylonian
The starting date, at least, we can say by our calendar. The starting date, we can say, as long as we've not made any gratuitous errors in our dating of when things happen in history, which is always possible, right? Assuming we've got these dates more or less right, by our calendar, this is our starting point, is one of about 4 periods in here. So, okay, a good thing to know is when your start date is. We don't know when our start date is. We've pointed to the second problem here. It'd be really good to know how long 483 years is. We don't know how long 483... Doesn't that seem like that should be the easy part, right? How long is 483 years? Some people have argued, and they have said, well, the Jewish calendar works off a prophetic year. They have pointed to what they call the prophetic year of 360 days, right? 12 months, 30 days each. That works out nice with some of the dates where, like, John in Revelation is counting, and he counts out 42 months, and he calls it 1,260 days. If every month is 30 days, that works nicely. John is just not a big fan of February. If that's the deal, you get one duration of time. Let's make it messier. The Jewish calendar in this time ran 350 some days because it was a lunar calendar, right? every month was a lunar cycle. 350 some days is 12 lunar cycles. But the Jews understood that 350 some days didn't line up perfectly with the duration of a year. You didn't cycle all the way around, I didn't say it didn't cycle around the sun, but you get the idea, right? You didn't get back to the same point year over year if you just count 350 some days. And so every few years we have a leap year, right? The Jews had a leap month. You would just kick an extra month into the calendar every few years, and that would balance things out. Mostly. Except that didn't always balance it out either. Every once in a while, the rabbis had to be like, we think we're off by a couple of days. Put an extra day in this month. And 1 month would be a little bit longer. Do you see the complication here? Right? Depending how long we think a year is it 365 days? Is it 354 days? Is it usually 354 days, except when it's not? 490 years comes out to different periods. Okay, so it'd be nice to know our start date. It'd be nice to know how long we're counting forward. It'd be nice to know what our end date is, right? We don't know our end date either. Are we counting to Christ's birth? To Christ, we don't know when that is, right? We do not have a date for Christ's birth. December 25th, we do not have a year on, first off. And if we had a year, we don't know that it's December 25th. We only think it's December 25th because there was a guy in the first couple of centuries who said, well, probably Christ's annunciation to Mary happens on Easter. And so if you count 9 months forward from Easter, you get to December 25th. That's where Christmas comes from. That's how we get our date there. So we don't have a day. We don't have a year. That's if it's his birth. If it's his death, that could be anywhere between 80, 30, and 33. We don't know which year it is. Maybe it's not his death. Maybe it's his triumphal entry. There is really interesting math that has been done that says if you pick one of these specific years and you count forward 483 years of 360 days each, you get to an exact date that might be the date of the triumphal entry. That's cool, but there's question marks on every piece of that, right? What you can say is that there are plausible dates here in this range that make sense to pick, that make sense to get to right about the death of Christ. And I think that is all we can say to a certainty, is that there are plausible starting dates that get you to plausible ending dates that could be the death of Christ. Whether we are reading that the exact right way is not clear to us. The New Testament does not ever point back to this passage and give us an exact interpretation on it. But it is at least reasonable to say these 483 years get us to the death of Christ, get us to thereabouts. Was that enough throwing numbers at you for a little bit? Do you see the problem of it, right? Like, do you see the complication here in trying to understand what this is saying for us? This points to Christ's ministry. And it points to it, if that's the right reading, it points to it pretty close, right? I mean, maybe it's not to the day. Maybe that guy's wrong. But it gets us in the right zone across almost 500 years, pretty clearly off some pretty reasonable start points here. So, we might say that's what it is. One of these start dates, one of these end dates, math is fuzzy, but it lines up about right. Or maybe this is all the wrong way of thinking about it. Maybe we are spending too long futzing over individual, little numbers and tweaks here. Maybe this is symbolic time, right? So an amillennial or a post-millennial looks at this and he says, look, the significant thing here is God is marking out a period for his final judgment, right? How long is it going to take? Not important exactly how many years it is, right? Forget the exact years. What's important is the kinds of events that are being tracked out. The anointed one, Christ, will come. The anointed one, Christ, will be cut off. And there will be a final ending that puts an end to sin and rebellion for all time. How long the periods are not the point. And that does bypass this whole messy dates and times thing pretty neatly, right? Can you think of one reason we've discussed this morning to maybe hesitate to be like, it's all just symbolic. It's all just symbols of time. None of it's literal.
Daniel's 70 years was exact.
It's pretty weird to have Daniel be praying, hey, God, you said 70 years, and that means 70 years, right? And have God reply, hey, listen, here's a period of time. Don't try to read this one literally, right? This one, don't even think that this could be actual days and years and times, right? That's a little strange. I have tried to read amillennial commentators on this, be like, how do you justify that? And I cannot find anybody who makes a decent defense of it, right? I cannot find anybody who explains, well, yes, it's literal here, but no, obviously that's not. It seems like they should kind of hang together. And that is a place that has frustrated me in some of these amillennial commentaries. Just you need some better argument than that than just to say, I think let's not worry about it. Vern.
I don't think 360 years worked for that long period of time because they would have been so far off by then. They would have certainly added days in. So I think you've got to be 365.
And that's plausibly correct, Vern.
Yeah.
That's about all I can say is maybe that's right.
They would have flipped the seasons by then.
Sure. But there's a last puzzle here, however we read this. If you read all these periods as non-literal, okay, well, the amillennial reading says basically that the 70th week is all the time from the death of Christ to now. Remember, we got 69 weeks into a 70-week period, right? The amillennial reading says Christ dies, and from about 30 AD to now is the 70th week of Daniel. It's all just been this same period. But if you look at Daniel and you say, well, Jeremiah was literal, I think Daniel's literal, then where the heck is this last week of years? And that's going back to Revelation, right? Because we all are familiar with the idea in Revelation that many premillennial or dispensationalist interpreters would have, where they'd say there's a last 7-year period waiting the 70th week of Daniel, right? Now, the interesting thing is this 70th week gets kind of split up into a 3.5-year period. We've already seen a 3.5-year period, right? Revelation's going to throw more 3.5-year periods at us. All this works out kind of clean if it's actually just 7 years and it's 3.5 here and it's 3.5 there. Which might or might not be the thing that's happening. Okay? But even if we take that week literally, let's just for the sake of argument say there is a final 70th week coming. There's still kind of a puzzle. Can I give you a puzzle? Have you had enough puzzles for the morning? I don't want to be like the little horn, be good at riddles. No, the wrong lesson is be like the little horn. But look at a puzzle with me here, right? The people of the prince who is to come. Now, back up a verse, yeah? An anointed one shall be cut off, right? So if we go, where am I? After 62 and 7 weeks, there will be an anointed one, a prince, right? Skip forward a little bit. After that, the anointed one will be cut off and have nothing. And the people of the prince who is to come shall destroy the city. Now, if you're just reading through that passage, who is the prince who is to come? Who does it sound like he would be? Yeah?
The Antichrist?
Okay, we look at this, especially in a premillennial frame, and we say, this guy, the prince who is to come, he sounds like a bad dude, right? He's going to destroy the city and the sanctuary. There will be war. That all seems pretty bad. We look at that and we say, that might be the Antichrist. There's another way to read this. The word prince has already appeared in the passage, right? The coming of an anointed one, a prince. Who did we say that was? Christ. If Christ is the prince here, is Christ the prince there? What possible sense does that make? Okay, hear me on this. remember the postmillennial understanding of the events of Revelation. I know we're in Daniel. Go with me on this. Give me some rope. The postmillennial reading is, this book is the story of God's divorce from the nation of Israel. Israel has rejected their Messiah, right? They have set him aside. They've persecuted the Christians, right? They have allied with Rome in order to persecute the church. This is the story of God's judgment on Israel in AD 70. Yeah? In that reading, Christ is the prince who is to come, and Christ is bringing judgment on Jerusalem. He is leading the people who will destroy the city, bringing an end to things. Does Rome come and destroy the city? Yes, certainly. Does Christ put an end to sacrifice and offering? He does, right? Okay, very literally, sacrifices ended in AD 70. But even prior to that, what's the book of Hebrews about, right? The sacrificial work is done. The sacrificial work is finished. Christ is the final sacrifice, right? Is this sacrifice and offering have ended because there's no more sacrifice needed? Do you see how that makes a totally different reading of the passage? Maybe this is a good thing. Okay, let's run with that. So if the prince who is to come is Christ, and this is, okay, the destruction of Jerusalem. Jerusalem is destroyed. It is made desolate. Christ makes a covenant with many. He here is still the prince. Christ makes a covenant with many. What's the covenant with many? The church, right? That's us. We are the covenant with many. He puts an end to sacrifice and offering by being the sacrifice. And then there is an abomination that makes desolation. Well, what is the most abominable event in human history? It's the crucifixion. The crucifixion of Christ is the marking of, right, is the marking then of this abomination that makes desolate. It is the final judgment of Jerusalem that this sinful act is carried out. That's a postmillennial reading of this passage. Do you see how wildly differently that points all the way through here, just on who we think the prince is in that one verse? Does that make sense? You got a question here for me? Yeah?
Could the prince and both of those princes be Christ, all right, but the second part of the destruction part, could that be symbolically referencing to the tribulation where there's the destruction of the earth? Is that possible?
Okay, it could be. That could be the reading here. But a postmillennial is going to say there is no forthcoming destruction of the earth, right? The postmillennials, for the most part, are the ones who say this is Christ. They're going to say there's not a tribulation coming. This is all historic. It is historic and literal judgment on Jerusalem, right? For the most part, premillennials who are going to see this as destruction in a forthcoming tribulation are going to say this is not Christ, this is Antichrist, right? And so there's a split there between the two. Just on the identity of that one guy, the rest of the passage changes entirely. Okay, coming forward a little bit here. Yo, I hear a voice.
Two things in that last passage. One is, it's interesting that it's the people of the prince that cause all this mayhem, not the prince himself.
It is, isn't it?
And then the other part is the covenant made with the people has a time limit. If it's supposed to be Christ, there's not a time limit in his covenant with his people.
Okay, so a couple of points you made there. There's a phrase about the people of the prince who is to come. Now, if the prince is the Antichrist, the people of the prince are this evil future Rome, right? The empire of the Antichrist, the beast from back in chapter 7, right? If the prince who is to come is Christ, who are the people of the prince who is to come? You'd think the Christians, right? Do the Christians destroy Jerusalem? They do not, right? we don't have an army at that point in time. That's not how things are working. And so I think that's kind of a mark against the post-millennial reading, is they have to be like, well, the people of the prince who is to come, that's Rome. Christ is bringing Rome in judgment on Jerusalem. And that, like, Rome is the people of Christ, that feels a little weird to me as an interpretation, right? I think that one becomes kind of a stretch. You said a second thing and it has gone right out of my head again.
There's a time limit in the covenant.
Yes, the 3.5 years that the covenant lasts, right? Why is the covenant 3.5 years? Well, remember, a post-millennial is going to say this is not literally 490 years here. It's not literally 3.5 years either. However, 3.5 years does match pretty closely to a significant time period, and that's the duration of Christ's ministry on earth. Right? So the 3.5 years, that's Christ ministering on earth. And at the end of that, you've got a second 3.5 years that's maybe up to AD 70 or up to the present or something like that. Okay, so I'm going to skip forward a slide or two here, because these are things we've kind of already said. So let me just lay this out. Postmillennial says, the prince who is to come is, we've said it several times, help me out here. It's Christ, right? The people are the people that Christ sends as his instrument of judgment. That is, they are Rome. The covenant with many is us, right? That is Christ's covenant with us as his people. And half the week is, we just said it, his ministry, the time Christ spends on earth. Good. In this view, putting an end to sacrifice and offering is good. Jerusalem is made desolate either by the crucifixion or by its destruction in AD 70. And that's what all this is about. Just everything everywhere is about the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70. When Christ in Matthew 24 says, when you see the abomination of desolation standing in the holy place, hey, what happens in the holy place during the crucifixion of Christ? The curtain is torn from top to bottom, right? The temple curtain that separates the holy place, that separates the most holy place off, that curtain is ripped apart, right? When you see that, says Christ in this interpretation, run to the mountains, the judgment on Jerusalem is at hand. Now, if that passage is all you read, I think this is actually the most natural interpretation. I will give this to the postmillennial reading. I'm not postmillennial, right? But I'll give this to the postmillennial reading. If you read Daniel chapter, where are we, 9? If you read 9 in isolation, I think that reading makes the most sense. The prince is the prince, right? The anointed one is the anointed one. It's one guy all the way through, and the one guy is Christ. Here's the problem. There's all that emphasis at the end of chapter 9 on this abomination and this desolation, right? And in this view, that's the crucifixion of Christ, is that whole chain of events, yeah? Here's the problem. Back in Daniel chapter 8, we also had a thing that was making desolate. And that thing that was making desolate was being carried out by the little horn, not by Christ. In chapter 11, we've got an abomination that makes desolate. And that's being done by a bad dude, not by Christ. All through the rest of the book, we have these two words, abomination and desolation, and it is always, in every other chapter, unambiguously, an enemy of God is committing an abomination that makes desolate. And so it is weird then to stop in chapter 9 and be like, but in this one chapter, it's Christ doing it. Christ is the prince here, and every other king who's described is just some unrelated chain of events. That's a little hard. That's a little hard for me to swallow at that point. I think that's a problem with this reading, is it has to kind of carve chapter 9 out from the flow of events in the rest of the book. You see me? Do you see that? Does that make sense? I think that is the biggest problem this view has, is trying to fit that in with the rest.
I think I could argue from a biblical perspective, the Temple Mount is still desolate.
So an argument that the desolation continues to this day. Certainly there's no rebuilding of the temple after AD 70.
There's no temple of God on top of the Temple Mount at this point.
Yeah, sure. I'm not going to finish Daniel, but let me do 2 slides, 3 slides, something like that. Do I hear 4? And we'll be done for the day. Okay? That's the posts. How about the ahs? Can we forget about the ahs? We can't forget the ahs. We got to be good to them. What do they think? They say this is all Antiochus Epiphanes. It's just all him. He's our little horn. He's our prince. He's all the bad stuff that happens here. Look, he fits. You know what? No, we've done enough for today. Can we stop there for today? Can we leave the amillennials for next time around? I'm seeing a lot of people look at me like this, and that is a sign we've had too many numbers and too many details for one Sunday morning. You with me on that? Can I get an amen? All right, okay. We will try to make better sense of this when we come back. Have a great week, and I will see you for our actual final week of Daniel next time around.